Representative Omar arrived in the United States at the age of 12, carrying her garments in a plastic sack without any money to her name. 2 decades afterward, her official economic declarations detailed personal wealth valued in the tens of millions. These included a business enterprise that expanded from $250,000 to $25 million within a year, a Californian vineyard, and her own constituency, which had recently suffered a $250 million loss during the most massive health crisis financial scam in national history. No individual had publicly linked those respective elements prior to this exact moment. This was because the child, who was raised by a substance-dependent parent in Middletown, Ohio, the same youth who authored a memoir regarding destitution before ascending to the vice presidency of the nation, prepared to face her and recount 3 specific narratives she preferred the country never hear. She intended to utilize the defense of religious prejudice. She planned to claim systemic victimization. She aimed to deflect blame toward the former president. Not a single one of those strategies would rescue her position. The Russell Senate office building carries the distinct atmosphere of absolute consequence. That statement serves as a literal observation rather than a figure of speech. The stone architecture possesses significant historical age. The pedestrian corridors remain notably constricted. The overhead architecture soars upward in a manner specifically engineered to diminish the psychological stature of anyone walking through the structure. This exact location hosted the infamous communist inquiries, witnessed the collapse of a disgraced administration, and watched a decorated military officer deliver falsehoods before facing the truth. The facility remains entirely indifferent to your personal identity. Its sole concern focuses entirely on your ability to respond to the inquiries presented. The designated chamber reached maximum capacity half an hour before 9 in the morning. Journalists crowded the rear section, representing all major broadcasters, syndication services, and a half-dozen international publications, while legislative aides pressed against the perimeter. Occupying the foremost seating tier sat 3 individuals currently anonymous to the media lenses, but destined for widespread recognition before the midday meal. The vice president walked into the room exactly 5 minutes prior to the scheduled start time. He was dressed in a dark blue tailored jacket without a neckpiece. This mirrored the exact attire he historically utilized during his legislative tenure. It matched the identical aesthetic he favored while visiting manufacturing plants back in his home state. It represented a deliberate visual statement asserting he refused to engage in theatrical displays for the audience. He took his position in the central leadership chair upon the elevated platform, accompanied by the Medicare and Medicaid agency director on one side and a specialized financial investigator from the Federal Accountability Division on the other. A pair of digital displays rested directly to his rear. A trio of organized portfolios rested on the desk facing him. The statesman had recently reached 41 years of age. He had served in the executive branch's second highest office for slightly over a year. Prior to that role, he functioned as a federal legislator. Preceding his government service, he operated as an investment fund manager. Earlier in his journey, he attended an elite Ivy League legal academy. His preceding chapter involved combat deployment to the Middle East with the armed forces. Long before any of those achievements, he was merely a youth in a mobile home community whose parents struggled intensely with addiction and failed to transport him home from his classes. That resilient childhood version of himself remained fundamentally present. That core identity never actually departed his character. Moreover, that deeply rooted perspective comprehended systemic deception in a manner exclusively granted to those raised entirely within its shadow, grasping it not through formal policy reports, but rather at a dining service where his matriarch meticulously saved discount vouchers and tabulated minimal funds while adjacent residents purchased fresh vehicles using fabricated medical assistance income. The representative made her entrance 2 minutes past the scheduled hour. She navigated the primary entrance accompanied by a trio of legislative aides, a media manager, and legal counsel sourced from an enterprise charging more per 60 minutes than the majority of her constituents earned over 7 days. She was dressed in a dark red traditional head covering paired with a dark formal jacket. She advanced carrying the physical bearing of an individual stepping into a confrontation she internally concluded she would inevitably dominate. She refused to pause for the presiding official to officially commence the proceedings. She similarly bypassed any formal preliminary greetings. She simply occupied her chair, repositioned her audio equipment, and immediately launched a verbal offensive. Prior to initiating this theatrical spectacle, I require the national public to understand the genuine reality unfolding within this room. This assembly completely fails to represent a legitimate legislative inquiry. This proceeding serves entirely as a partisan assassination attempt against my character. Her vocal tone projected the highly rehearsed outrage of an official who had honed this exact routine for nearly a decade. It was the specific indignation that generated her notoriety, established her public persona, and transformed a displaced immigrant into a massively prominent figure within the national legislative landscape. The presiding executive has neglected to ever visit the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, failed to converse with any regional immigrant households, completely avoided dining within the city limits, yet presently occupies that seat feigning concern for my constituents while his administration deliberately suspends over $200 million in health subsidies dedicated to pediatric treatments, senior assistance, and critical medical infrastructure. She pivoted her focus toward the broadcasting equipment, deliberately ignoring her interrogator in favor of the recording lenses. This entire scenario centers on penalizing a Midwestern state for supporting liberal candidates, targeting my specific demographic for merely surviving, and attacking me directly for possessing the courage to vocalize harsh realities regarding international conflicts, immigration enforcement agencies, and the systemic bigotry woven throughout the current executive branch. She adjusted her posture vertically while declaring that as a displaced survivor of armed national conflict and transitional settlement camps who navigated the previous conservative presidency, she would absolutely endure this current ordeal. Her legal representative offered an affirming motion of the head. Her administrative personnel reciprocated with similar validating gestures. The tactical approach remained transparent, relying on immediate aggression to capture the conversational framing and transform the inquiry into a tale of victimization prior to the initial interrogation. It mirrored the identical methodology that proved successful across various media networks, digital platforms, and legislative chambers over 7 years, where conservative figures expressed frustration, liberal allies offered praise, and substantive consequences continually failed to materialize. The vice president permitted her to complete her opening barrage entirely. He refrained from displaying any amusement. He equally avoided forming a scowl. He bypassed the measured, accommodating head movements typical of his senatorial colleagues, just as he skipped the rigid, disciplined stillness characteristic of former military lawmakers. He manifested a completely different physical response altogether. He visibly projected a deep sense of exhaustion. This was an authentic fatigue rather than a theatrical display, resembling the genuine weariness of an individual who traveled to the Midwest the previous day, dedicated 4 continuous hours absorbing the grief of local citizens inside a neighborhood facility, and subsequently journeyed back to the Capitol at midnight just to moderate a morning legislative session. He calmly inquired if the representative had concluded her remarks, noting that several dozen regional families desperately desired to understand the fate of their vanished $250 million, adding that their plight held vastly more significance than her prepared introductory remarks. The Congresswoman parted her lips before sealing them once again without speaking. He assured her she would receive abundant opportunity to defend herself, promising as much temporal leeway as she required. However, before she uttered an additional syllable regarding targeted harassment or religious discrimination, he insisted upon presenting a trio of specific individuals to the national audience. He unsealed the primary portfolio resting before him while completely ignoring its contents. His gaze drifted toward the foremost seating arrangement toward 3 citizens occupying chairs coordinated by his staff, dressed in their finest attire, gripping their fingers together in the exact manner adopted by civilians anticipating their initial exposure to a nationwide broadcast. He firmly stated that the ensuing investigation never actually centered around her personal narrative. The executive leader approached the submission of proof entirely differently than a traditional legal advocate might. He refused to arrange physical paperwork, broadcast audio clips, or reveal restricted governmental dossiers. He simply delivered 3 individual accounts, with every single narrative cutting as deeply as a sharpened blade. This specific methodology represented the core attribute the political establishment chronically failed to comprehend regarding his capabilities. He functioned poorly as a conventional argumentative tactician. He lacked the instinct of a courtroom interrogator picking apart witness testimony. He operated fundamentally as an author, an individual who managed the most tragic upbringing among elected officials by transforming the trauma into a manuscript consumed by a massive segment of the populace. His primary instrument of warfare relied entirely outside the bounds of structural reasoning. His strength resided entirely in the art of the compelling storyline. Furthermore, a perfectly crafted tale wielded by a master practitioner proved vastly more lethal than any official legal summons. He requested the chamber's attention to formally present a specific woman to the record. He motioned toward a middle-aged attendee in the primary tier wearing a dark red head covering with her fingers tightly intertwined across her knees. He explained that this citizen launched a child supervision facility within the local neighborhood roughly 6 years prior, servicing a dozen youths. She rose at dawn daily, prepared morning meals, instructed basic literacy in dual languages, and concluded her operations in the early evening. The regional government compensated her efforts with $700 monthly through established developmental assistance grants. This endeavor constituted her entire professional enterprise. This daily routine represented the totality of her existence. During the previous spring, regulatory authorities completely terminated her operational license. The closure occurred absent any personal misconduct, stemming instead from regional corruption so incredibly vast and ingrained that auditors completely lost the ability to distinguish legitimate child care operations from fabricated entities. This specific operator represented an entirely authentic business. The dozen infants under her supervision physically existed. Her grueling early routines genuinely occurred, yet she suffered institutional termination exactly mirroring the fate of the actual felons. She instantly forfeited her revenue stream alongside her official certification, while those 12 youths suddenly lacked a reliable environment. She currently functions as a retail transaction clerk at a major department store chain. Her demotion from autonomous proprietor to hourly employee occurred without any relation to conservative national politics, materializing strictly because rampant deception within her own geographic area completely annihilated her lifelong entrepreneurial achievements. The executive directed his gaze back toward the congresswoman. He noted the former business owner resided directly within her legislative boundaries and previously cast ballots in her favor during 3 separate election cycles. He accused her of possessing full awareness regarding the ongoing scam, emphasizing that the general public understood the reality, yet her sole reaction involved labeling the subsequent law enforcement probe as religiously biased. This devastated constituent diligently practices the Islamic faith. This specific voter visually adheres to traditional religious modesty garments. This affected citizen vehemently rejects the notion that the financial audits stem from religious animosity. This former entrepreneur firmly believes her elected official fundamentally betrayed her trust. The representative physically closed the distance to her audio receiver, insisting she perpetually vocalized opposition toward corruption and demanded justice, right as the executive interrupted without elevating his volume. He requested she provide him with a precise calendar marking to verify her claim. He challenged her to produce a single digital post, media briefing, or solitary instance where she publicly addressed her constituents declaring the deception immoral while pledging her assistance to the inquiry. Absolute quiet dominated the chamber. 4 individual moments ticked by without a response. Within the context of a federal legislative interrogation, a pause of that duration equates to an admission of guilt. He casually remarked that her inability to answer matched his prior expectations. He smoothly redirected his attention toward the subsequent individual occupying the primary seating tier. This attendee appeared as a more youthful citizen approaching her 30s. A tiny female toddler rested upon her knees, gazing upward toward the overhead illumination fixtures. He vocalized the name of the second constituent. He noted her female offspring had recently achieved 6 years of age. He stated the child navigated life with a severe neurodevelopmental condition. Federal health assistance historically covered vocal rehabilitation sessions on a tri-weekly basis. During the prior 7 days, capital distribution suffered a freeze, functioning as a provisional halt for accounting reviews rather than a permanent cancellation. However, depriving this specific child of her treatments for nearly a month translates to severe developmental regression requiring massive future intervals to successfully rebuild. The concerned mother dialed her elected representative's legislative headquarters. The connection routed directly to an automated recording system. She initiated a secondary attempt through the telephone network. The system once again relegated her to the digital answering machine. Upon her tertiary effort, a junior aide answered the line, claiming the office remained actively observing the unfolding events. The vice president echoed the exact phrasing with deliberate lethargy. He mocked the bureaucratic response regarding their passive observation. He highlighted the absurdity of a young child bleeding crucial developmental treatment while her elected officials simply watched the disaster occur without intervention. He stared directly at the lawmaker, allowing a noticeable layer of intense severity to infiltrate his vocal delivery for the initial occasion. This tone bypassed basic fury in favor of the freezing calculation inherent to an individual who devoted the previous afternoon to witnessing a mother weep privately away from the media spotlight. The financial block occurred entirely because $250 million unlawfully vanished from that specific administrative budget. The resources dedicated to this child were brazenly pilfered. Furthermore, when authorities halted distributions to conduct accounting reviews ensuring future capital reached the vulnerable rather than criminal syndicates, you publicly labeled the administration malicious. You appeared on major television networks shedding tears regarding the supposed systemic penalization of your demographic. You fundamentally failed to weep for this disabled child's immediate struggle, Madam Representative. Your emotional display existed strictly for the benefit of the broadcasting lenses. The lawmaker elevated her volume, declaring she battled continuously to secure the immediate reinstatement of those suspended assets. He quickly retorted that her combat exclusively occurred across social media platforms. This mother desperately required you to leverage telecommunications combating federal healthcare administrators and regional bureaucrats to accelerate her child's medical access. You completely neglected to initiate those crucial conversations. Our specific administrative team executed those duties instead. My personnel directly contacted the Federal Health Oversight Division the previous afternoon. This little girl secures the return of her developmental sessions at the beginning of the upcoming week. He allowed that revelation to permeate the chamber organically. I, functioning as the nation's second executive, found it necessary to execute the fundamental duties of the regional legislative representative simply because that representative remained entirely preoccupied with seeking broadcast fame. The physical atmosphere of the environment fundamentally altered. This bypassed the refined, subtle adjustments typical of overseas diplomatic summits. It embodied a distinctly aggressive, visceral domestic political realignment. It carried the acoustic weight of 200 attendees, releasing their breath in perfect synchronization. Furniture groaned under the shifting weight of observers urgently propelling their torsos closer to the action. Writing instruments dragged aggressively across notepads as the press corps simultaneously recognized they were actively documenting the subsequent morning's headline narrative. The interrogator pivoted his focus to the final individual in the sequence. This attendee presented as a gentleman past his half-century mark, sporting silver streaks throughout his facial hair. He maintained a remarkably rigid posture typical of individuals aggressively attempting to conceal their massive internal emotional fracturing. He identified the man as a former operator of a 20-child developmental center who maintained perfect licensing and regulatory compliance, only to suffer a half-year operational ban during the sprawling federal audit. By the moment authorities completely exonerated his record of any malicious activity, his entire customer base had definitively abandoned his enterprise. The Guardians systematically transferred their dependence toward alternative facilities. He entirely lacked the resources necessary to resurrect the business. This gentleman currently operates as a gig economy chauffeur, demoted from entrepreneurial status simply because the surrounding corruption swelled to such epic proportions that administrative bodies lost faith in absolutely everyone catching him in the crossfire. He demanded she acknowledge the true culprit behind the tragedy, deliberately eliminating the former president, immigration authorities, or religious prejudice as valid scapegoats. 7 dozen individuals currently face severe federal indictments. That represents 70 distinct perpetrators. $250 million evaporated during the most extreme viral era scam in the nation's chronological record, occurring directly inside your geographical boundaries under your supposed legislative supervision. This displaced business owner required absolutely zero digital commentary regarding Middle Eastern geopolitics from your office. He desperately required you to aggressively launch inquiries. He depended upon you wielding your institutional leverage, summons authority, legislative network, and national influence to shield his enterprise from the syndicates methodically annihilating his career and reputation. You utterly failed to execute those duties. He sealed the final dossier shut before intertwining his fingers. He summarized the presentation of 3 citizens intertwined with 3 distinct tragedies. This ultimately yielded a singular prevailing inquiry. Where exactly did the representative physically reside while her vulnerable constituency required her intervention the absolute most? He allowed a momentary lapse in the vocal assault. He offered to supply the geographical answer directly. She occupied broadcast studios delivering diatribes regarding foreign policy concerning the Jewish state. The investigative chamber plunged into a profound state of quiet. This failed to resemble the hushed reverence of a diplomatic European conference. It completely lacked any courteous or scholarly undertones. It equally bypassed the standard procedural hush common to other legislative office buildings. Those versions usually represent fleeting administrative pauses. This manifested as the specific suffocating stillness unique to the ancient Russell facility. It felt incredibly dense and soaked in historical consequence. It represented the distinct variety of wordlessness that physically burrows deep inside stone architecture and becomes permanently lodged within the mortar. 3 devastating personal accounts lingered heavily in the air. 3 flesh-and-blood citizens remained seated directly inside the primary viewing tier. Furthermore, a federal legislator occupied the opposite end of the chamber, completely devoid of any rebuttal that bypassed claims of religious bigotry, utilizing a defensive shield that miraculously felt exponentially weaker than it possessed a mere 10 minutes prior. The representative visually processed the devastating lack of acoustic feedback. She fully comprehended the catastrophic implications hidden within that quietness. She possessed sufficient electoral experience to recognize that whenever a chamber completely suffocates following an adversary's declaration, your position is actively deteriorating rapidly. Moreover, this specific official absolutely despised the concept of defeat. She refused to accept failure within her home district, denied it within the national capital, and aggressively rejected it universally. Consequently, she executed the exact maneuver she perpetually favored throughout her career. Whenever the perimeter began collapsing around her, she amplified her combative aggression exponentially. She loudly accused the presiding executive of traveling to the Midwest exclusively to secure advantageous broadcast footage. She proclaimed she maintained a constant weekly physical presence within the Cedar Riverside neighborhood spanning nearly a decade. She insisted she previously embraced the disgraced daycare provider personally. She claimed she also physically comforted the struggling mother in the past. She declared complete familiarity with their specific identities. She insisted she memorized those precise identities long before administrative aides cataloged them within an organized portfolio for his convenience. She accused him of weaponizing the suffering of vulnerable females to extract partisan leverage, confidently predicting the constituents would inevitably recognize the manipulation due to their deeply established mutual relationship. She reiterated their intimate familiarity with her character. She shifted her gaze toward the primary seating tier toward the first witness, eagerly anticipating the specific validation she historically commanded constantly. She sought the affirming cranial motion, the visual unity, and the unspoken tribal recognition traded between displaced immigrants communicating a shared unified struggle against the establishment. The former business owner fiercely refused to deliver the requested gesture. She instead directed her vision completely downward toward her own interwoven fingers. The desperate lawmaker pivoted her attention rapidly toward the struggling mother. This secondary constituent remained fiercely focused upon physically correcting her toddler's neckline, deliberately starving the politician of any direct visual contact whatsoever. The former chauffeur maintained a brutal, unblinking forward stare directly into the blank architectural surface positioned behind the elevated platform, looking effectively at an absolute void. A trio of individuals representing her core demographic, her electoral foundation, and her cultural brethren sat merely feet away, yet not a single solitary member permitted her any visual acknowledgement. The executive leader remained entirely silent regarding the devastating interaction. Any verbal commentary from him was fundamentally superfluous. Every single recording lens operating within the chamber perfectly captured the disastrous exchange. The specific visual of an elected official pleading with her base for tribal protection while encountering three sets of irises desperately seeking any alternative focal point became permanently immortalized. That specific visual sequence inevitably dominated all broadcast feeds prior to midday, prompting media analysts to universally christen it the exact 3 seconds responsible for terminating a political trajectory. However, actively witnessing the occurrence inside the physical location lacked any theatrical explosion. The moment felt brutally hushed. Furthermore, silence within the realm of electoral governance perpetually inflicts vastly more damage than noise. The interrogator ultimately broke the tension, informing the official that his Midwestern travel completely lacked any broadcast motivations. He claimed his geographical relocation occurred entirely because her legislative staff systematically ignored telecommunications originating from a desperate constituent. He sternly summarized that executing her fundamental duties would have negated his requirement to fulfill them in her absence. He extended his arm toward the middle portfolio resting on his desk. He suggested a transition toward examining her personal economic realities. The executive completely altered his tactical approach. He abandoned the utilization of emotional citizen narratives. He unsealed the secondary collection of organized documents. As he resumed speaking, his vocal delivery fundamentally mutated, shedding the cadence of an author and entirely ditching the rhythm of an orator. He adopted the precise tone of a financial auditor paired with a military veteran who fundamentally understood that numerical data separates a successful intelligence report from a disastrous failure. He expressed a desire to analyze her mandatory economic declarations, noting they represented open government archives accessible to any curious citizen. The representative's legal counsel propelled his torso aggressively forward. The attorney attempted to establish parameters, questioning whether the incoming queries targeted currently active open archives completely devoid of classified or investigative status, which he voluntarily submitted. The presiding official simply pivoted toward the primary digital display positioned to his rear. A pair of vertical data lists materialized directly adjacent to one another. The entire assembled audience possessed the ability to visually consume the information. He noted that during the previous calendar year, her spouse officially declared his investment enterprise possessed a market valuation resting beneath $250,000. He highlighted that merely 12 months afterward, that identical corporate entity officially documented a staggering valuation potentially reaching $25 million. Within a single chronological cycle, her partner's business witnessed a miraculous exponential expansion, multiplying its worth by anywhere from 24 to over 200 times its original figure. Simultaneously, a West Coast vineyard manifested on her official archives initially, boasting an estimated worth peaking around $5 million. He repeated the agricultural asset with noticeable incredulity. He aimed his vision directly at the politician. He recalled her arrival within the national borders as a preteen originating from a displaced person settlement. He countered with his own upbringing stationed within a Midwestern mobile home facility. He claimed total comprehension regarding beginning life bereft of resources, yet maintained an equal mastery over fundamental arithmetic. Furthermore, the calculations stemming from these legal filings completely fail to resemble traditional societal upward mobility. The staggering equations culminate entirely into a massive ethical inquiry. The previous executive leader publicly asserts your personal wealth rests near $44 million. You aggressively dismiss that specific figure as a malicious falsehood. He accepted her denial conditionally. Consequently, he demanded she immediately unseal her completely unredacted financial ledgers. He insisted she present the authentic data points to the general public. He challenged her to actively demonstrate the falsehood of the massive valuation claim. He promised to deliver a formal retraction directly across live broadcast networks should she succeed. The representative severely clenched the muscles along her lower facial structure. She defended the documents by claiming they represented corporate market worth rather than individual liquid holdings. She insisted her spouse functioned merely as a single participant among multiple corporate stakeholders. She swore his actual extracted compensation from that entity failed to breach $15,000. He repeated the staggeringly low compensation derived from an enterprise evaluated at $25 million. The vice president initiated another calculated delay. He deliberately allowed the absurd arithmetic to hover heavily throughout the chamber. He questioned her audacity in expecting the national citizenry to blindly accept that a stakeholder in a massively lucrative enterprise extracts merely poverty-level wages from the operation. I endured a childhood defined by severe economic deprivation. However, my impoverished background completely failed to render me intellectually deficient. A distinct acoustic ripple traveled across the spectator tiers. It strictly avoided resembling any form of comedic amusement. It represented a fundamentally more piercing vocalization. The noise served as an involuntary manifestation of absolute clarity. It embodied the collective exhalation generated when 200 individuals simultaneously witness a speaker vocalize the exact brutal truth they previously only dared harbor internally. A seasoned journalist representing a major syndication service eventually published that the phrase constituted the most destructive verbal maneuver she witnessed over 2 decades assigned to the legislature, entirely because its absolute factual nature was delivered by an individual possessing the authentic biographical authority to wield it, an authority fundamentally denied to any privately educated peer. The Congresswoman's facial expression shifted dramatically. This bypassed her previously utilized theatrical outrage, exposing a vastly deeper reality beneath the surface. She displayed the precise shock of an individual absorbing a devastating strike to an unprotected flank they mistakenly believed remained heavily fortified, having relied entirely upon claims of religious bigotry as an automatic neurological reflex. Her claims regarding systemic conservative harassment represented extensively practiced deflections. However, she completely lacked any prepared countermeasure against an opponent citing mutual historical poverty. She stood utterly defenseless against an adversary who survived identical historical deprivation, currently positioned directly opposite her, explicitly declaring that her fiscal calculations remained fundamentally illogical and acknowledging their shared awareness of that deception. She desperately grasped for the specific rebuttal that successfully protected her over the previous 7 chronological cycles. She deployed her ultimate defensive barrier, specifically invoking a solitary loaded term. She asserted the current scenario perfectly matched an established systemic trend. She claimed whenever a minority female practitioner of Islam originating from a displaced camp achieves prosperity domestically, she inevitably suffers immediate aggressive federal scrutiny. The individual faces instantaneous hostile interrogation. The reaction occurs without any delay whatsoever. The executive interjected, addressing her formal title. His vocal pitch descended rapidly, assuming a hushed, completely leveled frequency. The devastated daycare proprietor strictly practices Islam. The ruined former entrepreneur adheres to the same exact faith. The struggling mother equally follows Islamic religious principles. Those individuals completely avoided any hostile federal scrutiny. Those citizens suffered absolute annihilation strictly through widespread corruption. He propelled his upper body closer to the desk surface. You eagerly weaponize allegations of religious bigotry functioning as your primary defensive barrier. Unfortunately, you actively position that barrier facing the entirely incorrect trajectory. That strategy entirely fails to insulate you from my inquiries. The strategy strictly shields you directly from your own demographic, specifically abandoning the constituents who desperately require authentic explanations rather than rehearsed political slogans. The lawmaker aggressively transitioned toward an alternative tactical approach. She forcefully proclaimed the federal Justice Department's inquiries stemmed entirely from partisan maliciousness. She insisted the former conservative leader systematically pursued her destruction since the probe initiated during the prior Liberal administration. The executive noted the probe originated under a Liberal law enforcement agency. A Liberal federal prosecutor spearheaded the initial actions. Another triad of silent seconds evaporated into the chamber. You genuinely attempt to shift responsibility toward a conservative rival regarding an inquiry launched entirely by your identical political faction. The representative's legal counsel gently contacted her forearm. She violently retracted her limb away from his grasp. The sensitive audio equipment perfectly broadcast the sharp acoustic clatter of her wrist jewelry colliding against the wooden desk. The specialized financial investigator representing the Federal Accountability Division audibly cleared his area. The executive offered an affirming cranial motion in his direction. The professional delivered his analysis utilizing the completely flattened cadence characteristic of an individual who devoted 3 decades exclusively to examining corporate fiscal ledgers. He officially entered into the transcript that the economic valuation parameters authorized by national statutes remain incredibly expansive. He clarified that an official declaration spanning between 5 and 25 million technically covers any specific numerical reality contained within those boundaries. Nevertheless, the velocity of the capital expansion compared against the preceding annual filing represents an extreme statistical irregularity matching identical trends typically necessitating aggressive secondary scrutiny. The vice president repeated the specific phrasing regarding the mathematical irregularity. He echoed the syllables utilizing the precise rhythm of an interpreter actively translating highly specialized jargon into easily digestible conversational vocabulary. He bluntly clarified that the description translates into an occurrence completely devoid of reality. He emphasized such massive leaps never manifest within legitimate corporate environments. An enterprise entirely fails to vault from $250,000 to $25 million in 12 months, devoid of a monumentally irregular catalyst. Furthermore, absolutely zero individuals present within this chamber currently possess any rational explanation regarding the exact nature of that mysterious catalyst. He directed his gaze back toward the Congresswoman. I absolutely refuse to explicitly label your actions as legally criminal. I am specifically branding your current posture as intentionally evasive. Moreover, within the confines of this legislative structure, employing evasive quietness perpetually generates a disastrous visual. The executive firmly sealed the secondary collection of documents. He physically pushed the material away from his immediate vicinity. Upon unsealing the final organized portfolio, he deliberately avoided observing its interior pages. He directed his vision toward the overhead architecture, adopting the specific posture of an individual actively gathering internal composure, immediately preceding a declaration guaranteed to permanently alter the environmental dynamic. He announced an intention to pivot toward a subject completely divorced from financial irregularities. He declared the upcoming topic centered entirely around fundamental moral composition. The physical tension within the chamber intensified violently. Every single attendee organically registered the escalating pressure. He recounted that during the early autumn of the current year, a 31-year-old conservative organizer and parent suffered a fatal ballistic assault upon a Western collegiate campus, effectively assassinated strictly for utilizing his constitutional liberties surrounding verbal expression. He noted that merely a day afterward, whilst his grieving relatives selected a burial container, the representative appeared upon a liberal broadcast and heavily suggested the deceased victim actively provoked his own execution. He highlighted that slightly later, she amplified digital media branding the slain organizer a systematic instigator of violence. explicitly quoting the broadcast, which claimed the victim mirrored a mad scientist whose chaotic creation ultimately delivered a fatal strike to his throat. A paternal figure leaving behind dual offspring suffered a brutal assassination, yet an elected official actively distributed digital media gleefully cheering the tragedy. The representative nervously shifted her palms from the wooden desk down toward her knees and rapidly back upward. She desperately insisted she officially denounce the brutal action. She swore she established her opposition with absolute transparency. He countered that she offered a generic denunciation while concurrently distributing media honoring the exact same brutality within a singular calendar week. He labeled the conflicting actions not as a behavioral inconsistency, but rather as a highly calculated political maneuver. He summarized the tactic as offering polite rejection for traditional journalists while supplying aggressive celebration for radical supporters. He admitted total familiarity with the deceptive framework simply because every single elected official understands its mechanics perfectly. However, the vast majority of political operatives refused to deploy that specific weapon against a recently deceased citizen. The assassinated organizer possessed a legal spouse. He formally entered her specific identity into the record. This widow currently navigates solo parenthood. Meanwhile, a federal legislator tasked with representing the populace deliberately distributed media comparing her slain partner to a notorious fictional monster. His vocal volume remained entirely static throughout the brutal condemnation. Instead, his delivery executed a vastly more terrifying maneuver by adopting an incredibly sluggish pace. This mirrored the specific deceleration utilized by an individual harboring intense fury while actively deciding to completely mask its physical manifestation. It perfectly matched the lethargic rhythm his grandmother utilized immediately prior to delivering a verbal strike designed to permanently terminate any ongoing dispute. I currently maintain paternal responsibilities for a trio of children. An additional offspring currently approaches delivery. I find it completely impossible to even marginally conceptualize a reality where, following my violent murder, an active federal legislator would eagerly distribute media proclaiming my assassination remained entirely justified. You entirely avoid any requirement to hypothesize that scenario, Madam Representative, simply because you actively authored it into reality. The Congresswoman forcefully elevated herself from her chair while bordering upon screaming. She proclaimed she absorbs promises of fatal violence on a daily basis. She emphasized that hostile actors actively desire her termination continuously. She demanded he acknowledge the specific entity actively fostering those hostilities. She squarely assigned blame to his favored executive leader. She recounted that immediately prior to facing an assault within her own regional assembly, the former president demanded citizens display patriotism unlike her supposed lack thereof. She explicitly accused the leader of directing hostile forces directly against her. The vice president immediately announced his absolute rejection regarding any violent promises directed toward her person without exception. He insisted absolutely zero individuals warrant subjected harassment. He extended this protective umbrella over her, her relatives, and the entire human populace. He instituted another deliberate acoustic delay. The gathered audience tangibly registered the complete authenticity within his declaration. His denunciation lacked any manufactured political spin. Consequently, the subsequent verbal strike inflicted maximum damage precisely because the preceding empathy remained utterly genuine. He questioned her regarding another specific entity obligated to reject violent hostilities. He noted she owed that exact courtesy toward the slain organizer. Yet, bypassing basic decency, she distributed digital media gleefully honoring the tragedy. He highlighted the fundamental moral divergence between them, noting that whenever she faces danger, he publicly labels the aggression unacceptable. Conversely, upon the brutal execution of a conservative figure, she enthusiastically circulated digital media framing the assassination as cosmic justice. The representative lowered her body with extreme caution, completely abandoning her typically rapid hostile seating maneuvers designed to launch immediate counteroffensives. She collapsed against the furniture, exhibiting the specific trepidation of an individual realizing the foundational terrain recently fractured and might suddenly dissolve entirely beneath their weight. Her legal counsel finally engaged his personal audio equipment for the initial occasion during the proceedings. The attorney formally petitioned the presiding official for a temporary suspension, allowing him to privately consult alongside the representative. The executive delivered an immediate, absolute rejection. The interrogator completely ignored the attorney's physical presence. He maintained a relentless visual lock exclusively upon the Congresswoman. He noted the official voluntarily attended the session devoid of any formal legal summons. He reminded the chamber she launched the inquiry utilizing a lengthy monologue detailing her incredible ability to overcome massive adversity. He concluded she possessed sufficient endurance to navigate a final quarter of an hour. The counsel parted his lips, sealed them silently, and nervously glanced toward his employer. The representative refused to return his visual inquiry. She maintained a paralyzing gaze focused entirely upon a singular microscopic imperfection resting atop the desk surface, likely a tiny groove or finish defect functioning as a perfectly static anchor incapable of delivering a verbal assault. Up within the spectator tiers, a regional broadcast journalist dispatched a brief digital message to her superior, declaring the politician entirely finished and the battle permanently concluded. Her manager quickly responded, demanding she maintain her position to capture the final moments. This specific correspondent eventually secured a prestigious journalistic honor regarding the narrative she published later that exact night. The primary title of the publication boldly declared she personally witnessed the representative completely exhaust her vocabulary. The attorney scribbled a hasty message onto a physical paper pad before gently pushing it directly across the wooden surface. She visually digested the handwriting before elevating her gaze once again. The audio receiver remained actively broadcasting every minute sound. The media recording equipment continued operating flawlessly. The crimson indicators attached to every single recording lens within the chamber focused exclusively upon her facial expressions. She completely ignored the specific advice her counsel attempted to convey. She weakly protested that she dedicated nearly a decade serving her specific demographic. He brutally countered that she spent those years serving absolutely nobody aside from her own ambitions. He summarized her constituency as merely functioning as acceptable casualties within her pursuit of power. Those syllables impacted the chamber, resembling the definitive latching of a heavy gateway, lacking explosive volume but carrying absolute permanence. The legislative session officially possessed a massive 2-hour time allotment. The chronological reality already breached that specific boundary. The executive entirely avoided checking his personal timepiece. The representative previously checked her own chronometer on 3 separate occasions. Her legal counsel sought temporal updates 4 distinct times. The vice president expressed a desire to conclude utilizing a highly intimate narrative, justifying the maneuver by noting his adversary launched the session deploying her own personal history. He physically shoved the organized dossiers toward the periphery of his workspace. He eliminated every physical obstruction separating his face from the audio receiver. He began recounting his childhood anchored within a specific Midwestern industrial municipality. He plainly stated his female parents suffered severe chemical dependency regarding a brutal narcotic. He clarified this completely bypassed casual experimentation, representing an absolute crushing physiological addiction. This affliction routinely prevented her from providing basic scholastic transportation and consistently destroyed her ability to prepare evening meals. He recalled a specific terrifying incident occurring during his 9th year where she navigated a vehicle heavily intoxicated while he remained trapped within the rear cabin. He revealed his maternal grandparent ultimately assumed primary parental duties. This matriarch consumed massive quantities of tobacco daily, utilized intensely profane language continuously, yet provided him with a deeper reservoir of affection than any other living soul. She relentlessly drilled a pair of fundamental principles into his psyche on a daily basis. She demanded absolute honesty at all times. She additionally insisted upon fiercely protecting any vulnerable individual requiring assistance. He rapidly summarized his trajectory involving enlistment within elite military infantry, Middle Eastern combat deployment, subsequent domestic collegiate studies, and ultimate matriculation into a legendary legal academy, highlighting the miraculous journey spanning from a mobile home community to elite institutions and evolving from the offspring of a severe addict into the second highest federal executive. He acknowledged his adversary possessed a similarly dramatic narrative featuring an African displacement camp, massive regional armed conflict, domestic immigration as a preteen, and eventual electoral victory securing a federal legislative office. He sincerely praised her biographical journey as genuinely remarkable without a hint of sarcasm. However, he isolated the exact juncture where their respective philosophical paths violently diverged. He claimed that during the drafting of his famous memoir, he prioritized absolute factual transparency. He meticulously documented his parents' chemical destruction, the tragic narcotic-induced fatalities plaguing his social circle, and the broader socioeconomic disintegration consuming his hometown. He entirely refused to scapegoat alleged systemic prejudice directed against rural mountain demographics for those failures. He completely avoided assigning ultimate responsibility toward federal administrative bodies. He fundamentally rejected the practice of targeting external villains for the catastrophic implosion occurring strictly within his own cultural borders. He merely identified the internal sickness and demanded collective internal remediation. He noted the representative currently presides over a constituency experiencing a similar systemic meltdown. He summarized the carnage involving 7 criminal indictments, massive stolen capital, shuttered child care facilities, frozen medical subsidies, and innocent citizens absorbing the punishment generated by corrupt actors. He rhetorically questioned her official reaction to the devastating reality. He emphasized she completely avoided acknowledging the internal sickness or demanding remediation. Instead, she aggressively deflected scrutiny, blaming the exposure entirely upon religious bigotry, systemic prejudice, and conservative political malice. I analyzed my demographic and delivered unvarnished factual reality. She analyzed her demographic and exclusively supplied them with comfortable, preferred delusions. Furthermore, this behavioral trend extends vastly beyond mere financial corruption. It represents an incredibly deeply ingrained systemic reflex. Upon the horrific occasion where radical militants slaughtered thousands of citizens during a massive aerial assault, the lawmaker attended a gathering and casually dismissed the catastrophic event utilizing unbelievably trivializing vocabulary. He repeated the infamous minimized phrasing. Thousands of slaughtered citizens encompassing parents, emergency responders, and infants were effectively minimized into a trivial footnote by an active federal legislator. Following inquiries regarding international advocacy networks, she utilized social media, claiming a specific Middle Eastern nation utilized mystical manipulation to control the globe, while insisting domestic geopolitical support stemmed entirely from illicit financial bribery. She faced formal legislative condemnation. She offered a highly conditional expression of regret before rapidly equating Western democracies alongside notorious radical militant syndicates. This involved the identical radical regime her own demographic desperately escaped. This included the identical militant forces my military brethren engaged in brutal combat against. During every single one of these controversies, she possessed the opportunity to engage in introspection, issue genuine corrections, and demonstrate personal evolution. Yet on every single occasion, she actively selected the specific narrative framework, positioning herself as the righteous protagonist while casting the nation as the ultimate antagonist. That behavior entirely fails to qualify as legitimate public duty. That strictly constitutes a manufactured theatrical spectacle. Furthermore, the individuals absorbing the devastating consequences generated by that spectacle remain completely separate from capital politicians or broadcast network commentators. The genuine victims absorbing the damage remain the struggling citizens occupying her district who desperately required a dedicated legislative advocate yet merely received a digital media personality instead. He relaxed his posture backward against his chair. My matriarch frequently utilized a specific proverb: She claimed the world exclusively contains two distinct varieties of individuals. She divided the populace between those aggressively repairing damage and those cowardly shifting accountability toward external targets. She strictly forbade him from ever embodying that secondary cowardly archetype. He fixed his vision upon the Congresswoman completely devoid of fury or disgust, offering instead the freezing, absolute stare of an individual delivering an irreversible final judgment. He formally branded the representative as a perfect manifestation of that cowardly secondary archetype. The legislative chamber refused to explode into chaotic noise. Such a theatrical outburst remained entirely unnecessary. A vastly more subtle, terrifying shift materialized instead. A heavy permanence descended throughout the chamber, perfectly mirroring the atmosphere of a judicial panel universally agreeing upon an incredibly obvious conviction. The lone remaining task simply involved executing the necessary bureaucratic formalities. Successive legislative officials directed their vision toward their written materials, toward their intertwined fingers, desperately seeking any visual target completely divorced from the disgraced official's expression. The representative remained frozen within her chair. Her counsel frantically scribbled an additional message onto the paper pad before sliding it forcefully in her direction. Upon this secondary attempt, she finally digested the written advice. The brief message instructed her to utilize her right to legal representation while absolutely forbidding any further verbalization. She shifted her gaze between the physical paper and the audio receiver, proudly displaying its active crimson indicator. She weakly stammered a final desperate defense regarding her supposed dedication toward her demographic. The executive softly countered that the devastated daycare proprietor strongly disagreed with that specific assessment. He added that the struggling mother similarly rejected her claims of service. He confirmed the ruined entrepreneur equally dismissed her desperate protests. Furthermore, he confidently predicted that following the conclusion of these proceedings, massive swaths of the national populace would inevitably adopt that exact identical perspective. He consolidated his organized portfolios, aligned his scattered documentation perfectly, and elevated his gaze for a final occasion. He officially declared the legislative session completely terminated. He formally expressed gratitude toward the official regarding her voluntary attendance. He completely stripped the farewell of any mocking undertones. He equally bypassed injecting any genuine affection into the phrase. He delivered the phrase utilizing the exact cadence reserved exclusively for individuals you firmly intend to permanently banish from your future social orbit. The digital broadcast segments infiltrated the public consciousness through massive successive surges. The initial digital surge featured his devastating comment contrasting his impoverished upbringing against intellectual capability. That specific media file accrued over 30 million independent viewings prior to the clock striking midnight. The massive popularity completely bypassed maliciousness, thriving instead because the specific phrasing perfectly mirrored the exact hidden frustrations countless working-class citizens harbored internally for decades without ever witnessing an elected official broadcast the sentiment nationally. Commercial apparel featuring the phrase entered mass production preceding the total evacuation of the legislative chamber. The secondary digital surge highlighted his accusation regarding her heavily manufactured broadcast tiers. That subsequent media file rapidly secured 26 million separate viewings. A right-wing entertainment syndicate successfully integrated the audio directly into a musical composition within a mere 3 hours. The creation achieved continuous playback across all major conservative broadcast segments for an entire 7-day cycle. The tertiary digital surge focused entirely upon his grandmother's brutal classification system. This specific segment traveled with less velocity but penetrated the cultural psyche vastly deeper. This perfectly mirrored the traditional trajectory of ancestral wisdom, avoiding viral rage in favor of profound communal resonance. Matriarchs initially distributed the file before educators, military veterans, and eventually the massive swath of society, utterly exhausted by individuals perpetually weaponizing victimhood to excuse their own fixable failures, joined the distribution network. The premier conservative network broadcast the massive segment detailing the slain organizer entirely devoid of edits. A legendary conservative anchor maintained absolute silence for several seconds following the clip before solemnly predicting the executive would inevitably ascend toward the ultimate national office. Another prominent right-wing commentator aggressively looped the narrative regarding the ruined daycare proprietor 3 consecutive times. A famous conservative intellectual rapidly christened the entire exchange as the most destructive legislative interrogation witnessed since the infamous presidential scandal of the 70s. A vastly influential independent broadcaster completely dedicated 2 entirely separate episodes toward analyzing the event. His initial broadcast heavily targeted the massive systemic deception. His subsequent broadcast aggressively scrutinized the officials' bizarre economic disclosures. The primary liberal network desperately attempted to navigate the disaster utilizing extreme caution. Their prominent evening anchor displayed a graphic simply noting the executive interrogated the representative regarding Midwestern corruption. Another famous liberal host launched a segment analyzing the dynamic, specifically conceding that the interrogator successfully accomplished a rare feat by transforming a dry bureaucratic audit into a deeply intimate emotional narrative. Even the most fiercely progressive broadcast network ultimately surrendered to the devastating reality of the disaster. They admitted the lawmaker completely lacked any viable defense against the tragic citizen testimonies. The former executive leader launched a digital post slightly past 10 in the evening praising his protege's flawless execution. He aggressively labeled the representative as an absolute charlatan and a massive societal embarrassment. He insisted the citizens occupying her Midwestern state desperately required vastly superior legislative representation. He aggressively demanded the massive federal law enforcement agencies immediately launch deep investigations. He colorfully concluded that the Appalachian native utterly annihilated her political standing. The interrogator completely ignored his mentor's explosive digital commentary. Meanwhile, inside the national capital, the massive gears of administrative accountability finally initiated their destructive rotation. The premier Federal Investigative Bureau distributed a strictly singular, incredibly brief declaration. The agency formally announced their ongoing active scrutiny regarding the economic archives filed by various active and retired legislative officials. The primary internal legislative morality board publicly declared an intention to thoroughly analyze the fresh revelations extracted during the recent proceeding. The Federal Accountability Division aggressively broadened its investigative perimeter, targeting fiscal connections, bridging politicians alongside organizations absorbing massive governmental subsidies within her specific Midwestern county. The massive liberal institutional apparatus reacted exclusively by deploying an incredibly heavy curtain of pure silence. Furthermore, within the brutal realm of electoral governance, absolute quiet following a disastrous interrogation perfectly translates as the acoustic manifestation of an ally being actively abandoned to the wolves. The primary liberal legislative leader completely refused to distribute any open declarations. An anonymous informant intimately tied to his inner circle privately leaked to a major publication that the leader actively instructed her to completely boycott the disastrous proceeding entirely. Her fiercely loyal radical legislative coalition offered absolutely zero defensive commentary. Her closest ideological peer maintained an aggressive, unbroken silence. The most famous progressive icon, currently navigating the fallout from her own international diplomatic disaster, refused to vocalize a single syllable in her defense. Another prominent progressive ally entirely avoided stepping into the controversy. Absolutely zero participants affiliated with the massive radical legislative bloc offered any praise regarding her disastrous presentation. Not a single solitary member publicly declared her underlying arguments factually correct. They universally avoided launching any retaliatory verbal strikes against the vice president. The legendary socialist senator who previously supplied critical political endorsements and personally hosted massive rallies alongside her within her home district completely declined to publish any commentary. Whenever aggressive journalists from 3 distinct organizations contacted his staff demanding answers, they uniformly deployed an identical, incredibly brief response. The legislative icon completely rejects offering any public perspective currently. An anonymous progressive ally covertly informed a major political publication that the representative desperately needed to unseal her financial archives completely. The ally insisted that singular action of extreme transparency remained her sole viable survival path. The executive specifically offered her that exact opportunity during a massive live broadcast, yet she deliberately rejected transparency in favor of weaponizing religious bigotry allegations. The anonymous ally conceded that defending such a catastrophic tactical error remains a completely impossible task. The disgraced representative's staff finally published a formal declaration late in the afternoon. The release contained 3 incredibly brief, shockingly sterile phrases. The document robotically asserted the lawmaker supplied absolute compliance throughout the recent legislative inquiry. It insisted she maintains an unwavering dedication toward assisting the citizens residing within her specific Midwestern electoral boundaries. It concluded by formally rejecting any further verbal or written expansions regarding the controversy. The digital reaction across social media networks proved overwhelmingly catastrophic, generating massive waves of hostile engagement dwarfing any supportive commentary by exponential margins. The lawmaker retreated toward her home state that exact night, entirely avoiding public transportation options packed with regional voters capable of easily identifying her physical presence. Her panicked aides desperately secured an expensive private aviation vessel instead. She isolated herself completely within the deepest rear section of the luxury cabin. Her primary media manager frantically composed a half-dozen distinct public relations strategies during the journey. The politician fiercely vetoed every single proposed narrative without exception. Upon reaching her primary residence, she completely severed her digital connection by deactivating her cellular device shortly after sunset. Her spouse gently inquired whether she desired engaging with any televised entertainment programming. She silently retreated into her private sleeping quarters before firmly sealing the entrance shut. Despite the physical barrier, the faint audio bleeding from the broadcast receivers successfully penetrated the architecture. Her partner actively tuned the equipment toward the premier conservative news network. She clearly registered the distorted, continuous repetition of her exact identity echoing through the drywall. She completely refrained from demanding he switch the programming toward a friendlier alternative. She remained entirely hidden within her self-imposed isolation. Her primary legislative director dispatched a mass digital communication toward the entire staff late into the evening. The mandate explicitly outlawed any journalistic engagement, digital media interactions, or open declarations, demanding absolute operational quietness until leadership successfully mapped a viable survival strategy. A junior aide barely beyond his collegiate studies nervously replied to the thread, inquiring about the actual nature of that supposed survival strategy. Absolutely zero senior officials supplied a response. The massive digital thread completely stalled into absolute dormancy for the remainder of the evening. Slightly before midnight, a deeply ingrained psychological compulsion forced her to manually reactivate the personal cellular device she previously killed. She meticulously scrolled through a digital ledger displaying over a dozen completely ignored telecommunication attempts. A trio of those attempts originated directly from aggressive journalists. A pair emerged from her closest ally's administrative headquarters, yet glaringly lacked any direct involvement from the ally personally. A singular notification arrived from an entirely anonymous geographical code. The ledger completely lacked any outreach from the primary legislative leader, the legendary socialist icon, or absolutely anyone occupying the upper echelons of her party's hierarchy. She violently terminated the device's power supply once again. A prestigious public sentiment audit published 3 days post-disaster revealed her regional popularity completely collapsed by nearly a dozen percentage points. Evaluating strictly the displaced immigrant demographic occupying her specific county, effectively representing the absolute bedrock foundation responsible for her quadruple electoral victories, her overall approval violently plummeted from a massive supermajority down toward the low 50s. While technically maintaining a mathematical advantage, hemorrhaging such massive support across a mere 72 hours entirely bypasses the definition of a standard political dip. It undeniably constitutes a catastrophic structural shattering. Aboard the massive executive aviation vessel charting a return trajectory toward the national capital, the vice president's secondary administrative director exposed a digital display tracking the rapidly escalating broadcast metrics. The initial media file effortlessly shattered 30 million viewings, while the secondary clip comfortably surpassed 25 million. The specific segment detailing his grandmother's brutal wisdom actively gained massive momentum continuously. The executive demanded immediate contact with health administrators, prompting an aide to quickly interrupt, confirming the disabled child absolutely secured her developmental sessions for the upcoming week. He then shifted his focus toward the devastated childcare proprietor. He demanded his staff uncover a bureaucratic maneuver capable of aggressively accelerating her operational recertification. An aide eagerly volunteered to engage regional administrators later that exact evening. He fiercely demanded the engagement occur immediately prior to midnight rather than suffering delays until the subsequent morning. The assistant rapidly documented the strict order upon a physical notepad. The vice president directed his gaze through the reinforced glass, staring deeply into the massive expanse occupying the space thousands of feet above the earth. Far beneath the aircraft rested his Midwestern hometown, the exact location where his fierce matriarch historically occupied the primary entryway, anticipating his scholastic return, gripping a smoldering tobacco product while relentlessly delivering the identical daily inquiry. She consistently demanded to know whether he participated in any violent physical altercations. He habitually offered a negative response to her intense questioning. She praised his restraint and strictly forbade him from initiating hostilities. However, she aggressively amended the rule, demanding he utilize maximum violence whenever a predatory force targets a completely defenseless victim. He allowed a genuine expression of joy to cross his features. It marked the solitary occasion he displayed such emotion throughout the entire brutal ordeal. He quickly transitioned toward opening a massive classified dossier concerning hostile Middle Eastern regimes, largely because individuals occupying the highest echelons of federal power fundamentally lack the privilege of dwelling exclusively upon the present moment. The relentless arrival of the subsequent dawn remains an absolute, inescapable inevitability. Deep inside the Midwestern neighborhood later that exact evening, a collective of displaced immigrant females gathered quietly inside the disgraced proprietor's residential unit. Hot beverages boiled upon the heating element, traditional sugary delicacies rested atop synthetic dinnerware, and exhausted youth slumbered peacefully inside adjacent quarters. The collected group observed the massive digital broadcast segment utilizing a deeply constricted cellular display. The acoustic volume remained incredibly faint. The visual resolution severely lacked clarity, yet the underlying narrative possessed absolute, undeniable perfection. Her specific identity, her ruined commercial enterprise, and her entire tragic existence echoed directly throughout the ultimate national legislative chamber entirely because the nation's second highest executive actively wielded it. An attendee openly marveled regarding the executive possessing complete familiarity with her specific identity. The proprietor revealed he actually visited her shuttered facility the preceding afternoon, admitting she initially suspected it functioned merely as a theatrical broadcast stunt until he physically occupied a chair, delivered intense inquiries, diligently recorded her responses, and completely surrendered nearly an hour of his schedule. A heavy quietness descended upon the small gathering. Hot beverages cascaded into ceramic vessels while sweetening agents dissolved into the liquid. The most senior matriarch occupying the chamber, a fiercely loyal constituent who historically supported the representative during every single contest, who prominently displayed the politician's portrait upon her cooling appliance directly adjacent to her descendants, and who continuously declared to neighbors that the lawmaker functioned as their collective offspring fighting inside the Capitol, gently rested her ceramic vessel downward before softly suggesting their demographic desperately required entirely different leadership. Absolutely zero attendees offered any resistance to the terrifying proposal. They equally bypassed actively vocalizing their absolute agreement. They simply continued consuming their heated beverages in absolute unity. Furthermore, marking the premier instance across nearly a decade, the most ferociously dedicated demographic, the representative historically commanded organically initiated the singular treacherous conceptualization. She foolishly assumed they remained eternally incapable of generating, specifically visualizing, an alternative champion.